Today I'm talking with Dr. Jim Tucker, author of Life Before Life, about the subject that some people call loosely reincarnation, also an assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia. It's good to have you here today.
Thanks.
In your book, Life Before Life, you detail a number of cases of people who have claimed to have lived a previous life, and it's mainly your book focuses on children and their memories. Children between the ages of 2 and 3 sometimes give some very detailed accounts of a past existence. And you have the birthmark cases, and the cases where kids are injured. Several cases dealt with children being born without fingers or toes, but they had recounted it in their previous life. That's how they died. As you look at this, and you've studied a lot of the cases, and it goes back into the 1960s with Dr. Ian Stevenson, who was your mentor.
Yes.
You've detailed many, many cases. What does this say about the nature of our universe? We're not basically physical beings. Our brain is not the basic component, or is it what you call consciousness?
Yeah, well, it's certainly, the cases provide evidence that memories and emotions and sometimes even physical traumas can survive the death of the brain and carry over into another life. So that means questioning the whole materialist outlook that mainstream science has, that the physical world is all that there is, and that consciousness just sort of evolved accidentally as our brains evolved. What these cases, along with work in a lot of other areas, suggest is that there's more than just the physical universe, that there is this factor of consciousness that seems to be able to function separately, at least at times, function separately from a functioning brain.
If consciousness is produced by the brain, then when the brain dies, consciousness ends. It cannot continue into another incarnation. So if some of us do remember our past lives, then those memories cannot reside solely in the brain. The final phenomenon I want to discuss with you are these cases that my mentor Ian Stevenson investigated of very young children who claim to remember their past lives. To study these children, Stevenson traveled many times to remote villages throughout India to interview these children and their families. Our group at the University of Virginia has studied more than 2,400 cases of these very young children who spontaneously start talking about their past life. About half of these children live in Asia, most of them in India, Burma, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. They usually begin speaking about these past life memories between the ages of 2 and 5 years. And in most cases, those memories tend to fade between the ages of 6 and 9 years. The child gives enough detailed information that we can identify the past life in 60% of these cases. As you might expect, these cases are not easy to investigate. This is a picture of Ian Stevenson interviewing a young girl and her parents in an Indian village with an interpreter sitting next to him. These children often live in remote villages that are hard to reach, and they often require Western researchers to interview the children through a translator. There are several features of these cases that challenge the assumption that all our thoughts and memories are produced by the brain. First, these children often have detailed and specific memories that correspond to the life of someone who had lived and died in a distant location, of whom they could have had no knowledge by normal means. They will mention the names and occupations of relatives and friends from the past life, and often the specific details of how that past life ended. In many cases, we can take the child to the remote village where he or she claimed to have lived previously, and the child is able to identify people and places he had never seen before in this life. Second, these children sometimes exhibit unusual personality traits, likes and dislikes, that are incompatible with their present lives. For example, some of these children recall a past life of the opposite gender. and they want to dress and play like someone of the opposite gender. A child born to a Hindu family may recall a past life as a Muslim, and he will reject the food his mother cooks because it was not prepared in the Muslim manner. Many children who recall past lives have fears that they relate to their past lives. For example, a child who recalls having been drowned in a well may have an unusual fear of water. Third, some of these children exhibit unusual skills that they have not been taught, and indeed that no one in their village knows. For example, a child may be able to play a musical instrument without being taught, or may have skills related to their occupation in the past life. We have studied children in Sri Lanka, in villages where only the Tamil language is spoken, and yet the child can converse in Sinhalese. Finally, some of these children have very unusual and unexplained birthmarks or birth defects that they attribute to their death in a past life. These birthmarks and birth defects that are said to correspond to the death wounds in the past life occur in about 1/3 of the children we have investigated. Sometimes the birthmarks fade as the child grows up, but in other cases they do not. And of course, birth defects persist throughout the life of the child. In 18% of these cases, we can confirm through medical records or autopsy reports that the death wounds from the past life do indeed correspond to the birthmarks or birth defects in the present child. Let me give you a few short examples of these unusual birth defects. These are the hands of Mien Thein, a Burmese girl born in 1956. She remembered the life of a man who was riding home on his bicycle when he was stopped by a gang who had been hired to kill him. They made him get down on his knees and prepare to cut his head off with a sword. At the last moment of his life, as he was on his knees facing the swordsman, he suddenly raised his hands to plead for mercy, or maybe to protect his face from the sword. And the fingertips on both his hands were cut off by the sword. As a child, this girl, Mien Thein, insisted on wearing boys' clothes and referred to her actions with masculine verb forms. These are the hands of Lek Pal, an Indian boy born in Uttar Pradesh. He remembered the life of another boy named Hukum Singh, who lived in a distant village, who, when he was only 3 years old, got his right hand caught in an automatic fodder chopping machine, and he lost fingers of just that one hand. When Lek Pal was eventually taken to the village where Hukum Singh had lived in the past life, he identified the correct location where the accident had taken place, and he also correctly identified the man who was operating the fodder chopper machine when the 3-year-old Hukum Singh had caught his fingers in. This is the back head of a little girl named Jacinta Agbo, born in Nigeria. She was born with this unexplained 3-centimeter wide birthmark that goes completely around her head. There is no physiological mechanism that can explain a birthmark of this type. She remembered the life of a man who had been hit on the head with a club during a quarrel 10 years before she was born. And the man had surgery to drain the blood from his head and reconstruct the broken skull bones. This photo was taken when she was 2 years old. When we interviewed her several years later, she showed definite masculine traits and habits.
How do we explain these birthmark cases? I confess that when I got involved in this work, even though I read a lot of really interesting cases, the birthmark cases I was not comfortable with, because I didn't see how a wound on a dead body, even if we accept reincarnation, how a wound on a dead body would then show up in the next life. But Ian talked about in reincarnation and biology evidence in other areas of work showing that mental images can have specific effects on the body. memories can sometimes induce specific effects in susceptible individuals. So there was a Dr. Moody. This was not Raymond Moody, who has written so much about near-death experiences, but a different Dr. Moody, who published a couple of cases. One was about a man who vividly recalled a traumatic event from 9 years before where he had had his arms tied behind him. And this man developed what certainly looked like rope marks on his arms. There was another case of a woman who recalled being beaten with a whip by her father when she was growing up. And specifically, she recalled an incident where she was struck on the left shoulder, and she developed this mark on her left shoulder. So we see from these cases that memories can produce effects on the skin temporarily. Well, in our cases, if the person died and the consciousness continued, they could take those memories with them, and then they would imprint the developing fetus. So in this case, the wounds would be permanent rather than just temporary marks on the skin, because the fetus would continue to develop with that imprint. And the birthmarks that show up in these kids usually represent wounds that would impact the previous consciousness the most. So the fatal wounds, somebody being killed, which of course is a very traumatic experience presumably to go through, those wounds would stay with the consciousness. So this would mean that it's not the wound on the previous body itself that causes the birthmark, but more it's the effect that it has on the consciousness that then leads to the birthmark. And to me, that makes a lot more sense than somehow this physical wound literally producing the same thing in the next life. But it wouldn't necessarily be a precise match, because it's filtered through the consciousness. So the birthmarks may not match precisely with what you find on the body during autopsy. Now, as if these cases aren't strange enough, there's also a phenomenon that Ian termed experimental birthmarks. And these involve a practice in several areas in Asia in which, after someone dies, a person takes a substance, usually soot or paste, makes a mark on the body, and says a wish or makes a prayer that they take the mark with them to their next life, where it'll show up as a birthmark so that they can be identified. And this is usually done with the expectation that the child will be born into the same family as the person who died. So Ian studied 20 of these cases, and then a colleague and I found 18 more. So I'll tell you about a couple of them that we found. One, it's a little boy who's thought to be his grandmother reborn. And before she died, she said that she wanted to come back as a male. She said it was because she wanted to have a mistress one day, the way her husband did. And then after she died, her daughter-in-law took some white paste and just made a mark down the back of her neck. And then a year later, a grandson was born, and he had this mark down the back of his neck. And then he didn't talk a lot about a past life, but he did make several statements recalling his grandmother's life. Another case from Thailand is this little girl who was born 5 years after her grandfather died. After he died, her aunt made a mental wish and then took some soot from the bottom of a rice pot. And I had one of the villagers put some soot on his finger just to show what it looked like. Took some soot from the bottom of a rice pot and made a mark on his right leg above his ankle. And then 5 years later, this little girl was born with this mark on her right leg above her ankle. Now, when we saw her, she was only 2.5, and at that point, she hadn't made any clear statements related to the past life, but of course, she was still quite young. And then the last case of this type that I want to tell you about is one of Ian's cases from Burma. And this woman, unfortunately, is the previous person in this case. She was born with a congenital heart defect, and then she died during open heart surgery when she was 20 years old. After she died, 3 of her classmates volunteered to prepare her body for cremation. And they'd heard about bodies being marked, so they took some red lipstick and made markings on the back of her neck. And then a year later, her older sister gave birth to a little girl who had, I hope you can see, it doesn't show up real well, but red area on the back of her neck. Now, as Ian pointed out, the women picked the worst possible spot to mark a body because stork-bite birthmarks are pretty common and will occasionally persist into childhood. When Ian was studying the case and met the little girl, he also noticed, and I hope you can see without too much imagination, he noticed this pale white line running from about mid-sternum to mid-abdomen that looked very similar to a heart surgery scar, except it was lower, at least by the time when Ian met her. And she had talked about the previous person's life, and in fact, she wanted to be called by the previous woman's name. And she would also call her mother the term for older sister. And did the same with the other family members, calling them by the relation that the previous woman had had with them. So when Ian investigated this case, he interviewed the women who had marked the body separately. And he discovered that one of them had never met this little girl. So unannounced, he takes the woman to the family's home. They walk in, and he says to the little girl, "Who is this?" And she immediately said, "Mint Mint Ooh," which in fact was the name of the woman who had marked the body. So how do we explain these cases? Well, if we're open to deciding they're more than just coincidence, then there are at least 3 possibilities that are worth considering. One is a concept called maternal impression. Back in the late 1800s, there were a lot of cases reported in the medical literature in which a pregnant woman would see a very upsetting sight, like the sight of a deformed individual, and then would give birth to a child with that deformity. And the concept was eventually rejected because people couldn't imagine a physical explanation for it. But there were a lot of cases reported, and some of them were quite striking. There was one that Ian discusses in which a pregnant woman had a brother who had cancer of the penis and had his penis removed. The woman saw his wounds after surgery and then gave birth to a boy with congenital absence of the penis, which is an incredibly uncommon condition. Now, the difference is that with maternal impression, the idea was that the mother would see a very upsetting sight, whereas with the experimental birthmarks, the marks are not particularly upsetting. But in both, it would be that an image in the mother's mind then leads to the change in the baby. The hitch with that explanation for our cases is in the 18 that we studied, the mother only saw the mark in 5 of them. Now, there were 5 other cases in which the mother may have heard about the mark, but with the others, the mother didn't even know about it. So it doesn't seem that maternal impression could explain those cases. There's also the possibility that prayers and wishes of the mourning family or the marker then lead to the development of the birthmark. So it would be a psychosomatic effect where the minds or the consciousness of other people induces the mark on the child. So if a family is grieving somebody who died, they know about the mark, they intently want that person to return, then perhaps they could unconsciously really induce that mark in the child. The third possibility, of course, is that the child is the continuation of the consciousness of the deceased person, and they carry the mark with them as the marker had intended. And in the 18 cases that we studied, even though many of them were quite young, 6 of them, the children had reported memories of the past life. So that would seem to be the most reasonable explanation for those cases. But regardless of the explanation, which of these we choose, this phenomenon does provide evidence of an effect of consciousness on a physical body. So to wrap up, looking at all the cases, not just the birthmark ones, they provide, I think, pretty strong evidence that memories and emotions and sometimes physical trauma can survive after death and carry over to another life. In our cases, the consciousness appears to have continued on and had another life here, but it may be that all kinds of existence can occur after we die. I don't assume that we all come back here. I think the possibilities may be more than we can even imagine. And in the overall picture, I think consciousness may be even bigger than we can imagine. So the birthmark cases are examples of consciousness affecting the physical. But they may just be the tip of the iceberg. And I think that not only can consciousness affect the physical, that I actually think it's the creator of the physical. I think that consciousness is the core of reality, and the physical world grows out of it. And it's not just me who says that, many people do, including some physicists. So I want to finish up with a quote from Max Planck, who was the father of quantum physics, so he's a huge name. Well, Max Planck said, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness." So I think if consciousness is indeed fundamental, then we should not be surprised if it continues on after we die.